Second reading of the Contaminated Blood, Support for Infected and Bereaved Persons Bill, Lord Morris of Manchester.
My Lords, I beg to move that this bill be now read a second time. My Lords, we're meant to debate a measure conceived and drafted to give solace and support to arguably the most needful minority in Britain today. A small and stricken community of barely 5,000 people already disabled by a rare lifelong blood disorder requiring continuous medical treatment. Haemophilia patients have twice been infected en masse by contaminated blood and blood products used in their NHS treatment. 95% were infected with hepatitis C and 1 in 4 with HIV. Of the 1,243 haemophilia patients infected with HIV, only 361, 29%, are still alive. And the much higher number of deaths among the hepatitis C infected patients is still increasing. As of now, an estimated 1,974 haemophilia patients have died from being infected by contaminated NHS blood and blood products. In this worst ever treatment disaster in the history of the National Health Service, if anyone disputes that assessment, they should look at the finding of distinguished statisticians that the disaster has involved the haemophilia community in a loss of life more savage in proportion to the numbers of people at risk than the Black Death. And while stigma is less explicit today than the warning cross scrawled on a plague victim's door, it's no less cruelly oppressive in terms of social exclusion at a time of direst need. Yet even the grievous and still ascending death toll doesn't tell the whole story of the suffering inflicted on the haemophilia community. As my dear and inspirational friend, the noble Baroness, Lady Campbell of Surbiton, whose husband was among the haemophilia patients fatally affected, so movingly said in this House on 23rd April, the history of the disaster is one of unspeakable suffering also for mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, wives, husbands and friends seeing their loved ones die. For parliamentarians, there can be no higher duty than to ensure just treatment and due care for people afflicted and bereaved by life-threatening medication supplied by the state. But as participants in this debate know, infected haemophilia patients, many of them now terminally ill, also suffer privation at a depth most other people can barely imagine. They speak day by day to me of no longer being able to work full-time, if at all, of having been made uninsurable by the prohibitively expensive premiums demanded of them by insurers, and among numerous other burdens, of costs generally being too high for them to cope with. My Lords, I am most deeply grateful to all noble lords who will be speaking in the debate, including, of course, my good and noble friend Baroness Thornton, who will be replying for the Department of Health. Her awareness of the depth of anguish and despair in the haemophilia community is well understood across the House. I want at the outset today also most warmly to congratulate my noble and learned friend Lord Archer of Sandwell on the highly prestigious Outstanding Achievement Award he received at this year's Parliamentary Awards ceremony 3 days ago. The award was backed by a very wide range of charities, as well as by members of all parties and of none, both here and in another place, for parliamentary service of the highest distinction And, my Lords, nowhere is that distinction more clearly exemplified than by the landmark importance of the independent public inquiry he headed into the Contaminated Blood disaster. I have two interests to declare in the debate, not pecuniary, as President of the Haemophilia Society and as the architect of the inquiry, conducted so skillfully and with such excelling integrity by my noble and learned friend. As he knows, I'm grateful beyond words, both to him and his colleagues on the inquiry team, Dr. Norman Jones, Emeritus Senior Consultant Physician at St Thomas's Hospital, and Judith Willits, Chief Executive of the British Society for Immunology. No inquiry team could possibly have shown more commitment or have been more eminently qualified for the arduous task they so readily and so ably undertook, entirely without remuneration. My Lords, I'll be commenting on the bill clause by clause as we proceed, but taken together, they transform the Archer report into the language of legislation. And my purpose in working during the summer recess to prepare this bill, with unstinting help from Sarah Jones of the Public Bill Office, and on medical issues from Dr. Norman Jones, was to guarantee parliamentary time for this House now to debate the government's response to the report of the inquiry. Together with noble lords who took part with me on 28 April in a debate to amend the health bill, then before the House, I thought we had an assurance very close to that guarantee from my noble friend Lord Darcy, speaking for the government and having just announced that their response to the Archer report would be published at an early date, he went on, and I quote, "Furthermore, we'll of course assist as far as possible in securing a debate on the government's response." Yet in the 3 months that then elapsed before the summer recess, there was no sign anywhere on the parliamentary horizon of a debate being arranged. So there was nothing precipitate in my decision to spend much of the recess addressing the tasks involved in having this bill ready for a first reading in your Lordship's House by 19 November. For it was then already 9 months after publication of a report whose recommendations were vitally urgent to afflicted patients and bereaved families on the day they were published last February. The privation I described among them is addressed in clause 4 of the bill, which deals specifically also with the crudely discriminatory treatment now of widows of infected patients in deciding whether they are eligible for financial help solely on the basis of when their husbands died, even where they died within 2 days of each other from exactly the same cause. The ending of that discrimination was one of the issues of long-standing concern to the haemophilia community, strongly and repetitively emphasised in evidence to the Archer inquiry. My Lords, why I mention it first today in referring to clause 4 of this bill is because several of the widows excluded from help, who wanted very much to be here for this debate, have contacted me to say that they simply couldn't afford the fare. And this at a time, my Lords, when just 5 NHS officials are seen to have been paid a total of almost £6 million over the last year. Clause 4 addresses the whole range of compensation issues and has been welcomed as fair and balanced by commentators on social policy of wide experience, as was the Archer report itself, all across the media. Everyone knows that there will be costs in giving full effect to the report, but there will also be priceless benefits in enabling haemophilia patients to live fuller and more fulfilling lives. Clause 1 of the bill creates a widely empowered statutory committee with patient and family representation to advise government on the management of haemophilia, and clauses 2 and 3 deal with blood donations and improving medical care, while clauses 5 and 6 are about monitoring progress and the effects of regulations made under the legislation. My Lords, turning to issues not dealt with in the government's response to the Archer report, but worthy of close attention in this debate, there's the spectre now of a third deadly scourge facing haemophilia patients. In response to parliamentary questions about the growing number of patients known by the Department of Health to have been treated with blood from donors who've since died of variant CJD, I was told on the authority of the Chief Medical Officer that the risk of infection in such circumstances was purely hypothetical. That demonstrably isn't the case today. A post-mortem on a hepatitis C infected patient, now having found variant CJD in his spleen, and ministerial statements made to Parliament on this further scourge urgently need updating. We also need to know how the government now assess the variant CJD threat to the haemophilia community. And Lords, as the House knows, the Archer reports about more than the unmet needs of infected patients and bereaved families. It addresses also highly disturbing administrative shortcomings, serious omissions, and a failure to inform Parliament of the facts on why provision made in other countries is so much better than here in Britain. For example, there's no mention in the government's response to the Archer report's findings on the behaviour of the Blood Products Laboratory, BPL, in failing to comply with the requirements of the Medicines Act. This is a hugely important issue, as is that of the effect of using Crown immunity to avoid any question of legal redress. The Archer report states in July 1979, the Medicines Inspectorate visited BPL, following which they reported that the buildings were never designed for the scale of production envisaged, and commenting that if this were a commercial operation, they'd have had no hesitation in recommending that manufacture should cease until the facility was upgraded to a minimum acceptable level. My Lord, starkly, the Archer report then states BPL was rescued by Crown immunity. Adding, and I quote, BPL's existing plant continued production, relying on Crown immunity to dispense with all the requirements of the Medicines Act, but was able to meet only 40% of the national requirements. That can only mean that by the use of Crown immunity, a relic of feudal England, the lives of countless haemophilia patients were put blatantly and gravely at risk. And although the seriousness of this had already been underlined by my noble friend, Lord Darcy himself, when responding to exchanges about thalidomide on the 16th of January, he referred to, and I quote, the tremendous amount of work that has gone on into the marketing, testing and regulation of drugs, as encapsulated in the Medicines Act 1968, from which society has benefited greatly. My Lords, could there be any clearer text than that for condemning the BPL's use of Crown immunity to dispense with all the requirements of that renowned and so vitally important statute? From whom was the BPL rescued by its use of Crown immunity? First, of course, from those afflicted and bereaved by the disaster. At a stroke, they were denied any right to legal redress, a denial made all the more cruelly unjust by the refusals of successive governments to hold a public inquiry. They were left with no hope of any independent assessment of where responsibility lay for their plight until the Archer inquiry was announced. And of course the BPL itself was rescued from any threat, from any danger of censure by the courts. Crown immunity was abolished by John Major in 1991, and the afflicted and bereaved ask why, since the present government clearly have no intention of reinstating Crown immunity, they can't now review the claims of those from whom the BPL was rescued by that immunity. The noble Lord Thomas of Gresford, who is much respected here and outside the House for his role in this policy area, said in a speech on 23rd April that it would be possible for actions to be brought now if, dating back as necessary, the government chose to waive Crown immunity. Thus the question today is whether the government opposed, as they must surely be, to restoring Crown immunity, have considered this possibility and will now do so. Now, Lords, at the very least, ministers could review the claims where it's still feasible to do so, of the victims of contaminated NHS blood, from whom BPL was rescued by Crown immunity. And if anyone thinks there's no way now of being able to do any more to help the afflicted and bereaved, they should look at how the Irish government found ways of compensating victims there by more than anything even contemplated by ministers for NHS-infected patients. Let me first, however, make it absolutely clear that the government of the Republic did not, as stated in this House by my noble friend Lord Warner, briefed by and speaking for the Department of Health on the 25th of November 2004, and I quote, set up their Hepatitis C compensation scheme following evidence of negligence by the Irish Blood Transfusion Service. That is untrue. Again, it was wrong for the Department of Health to have briefed my honourable friend, Gillian Merrin MP, to tell the House of Commons on 23rd June that, and I quote, as a result of a judicial inquiry having found failures of responsibility by the Irish Blood Transfusion, had, and I quote, concluded that wrongful acts had been committed, the government of the Republic decided to make significant payments to those infected. My Lords, Brian O'Mahony, Chief Executive of the Irish Haemophiliacs Society, who was personally involved in the negotiations with the Department of Health and Children in Ireland in 1994-5, which led to the establishment of a Hepatitis C compensation tribunal on a statutory basis on 16 December 1995, has written to me to say that my honourable friend's statement to the House of Commons on 23rd June was, and I quote, misleading and erroneous. He goes on to say that the Compensation Tribunal heard its first cases in early 1996 and that the first award for persons with haemophilia was made in March 1996 and concludes, I quote, therefore the establishment of the Hepatitis C Compensation Tribunal and significant payments by the Tribunal predated the setting up of both the Finlay Tribunal, established in October 1996, and the Lindsay Tribunal of Inquiry, set up in September 1999. I have a letter also from Kay Mayer of the Republic's Department of Health and Children confirming Brian O'Mahony's statement, which concludes with the words, and I quote, I hope this will serve to clarify the sequence of events in Ireland for Ms Merron, and I trust her department will now correct the record. My Lords, I look forward to hearing its response to that extremely important request. To conclude, I want briefly to mention two further issues. First, the treatment by the Department of Health of the Archer inquiry's call for help in securing the financial future of the Haemophilia Society, faced as it is by ever-increasing requests for assistance while trying to cope with the punitive 70% cut made recently in its government grant. That the inquiry's call has not already been met appalls noble lords in all parts of the House, and I'm especially grateful to Lady O'Caline for her active support on this issue. Finally, I want to make it clear in this debate today that sadly, as well as anguish and despair, there's evidence now also of some anger in the haemophilia community about the treatment of the Archer inquiry and its report. It was 5 weeks ago that a then terminally ill, now deceased haemophilia patient who gave evidence to the inquiry said to me, I quote, "While we crossed the whole of Britain to meet the Archer inquiry, health ministers refused even to cross the road to do so." My lords, in the interest of creating hope in place of anger, let me assure the haemophilia community as a whole that they have here in this House both a ready understanding of their despair and an unbreakable resolve that if this struggle has to go on, then go on it will until right is done. My lords, I beg to move.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time.
My lords, not for the first time, I must congratulate my noble friend Lord Morris, not only on securing a place for his bill and on the clarity with which he introduced it, and so making possible this debate, but on his unflagging concern and support over many years for those who are the victims of misfortune. They could have no better champion. With the campaigning skills of the strategist and the unrelenting determination of the bulldog, my noble friend well deserves his reputation. And this isn't, of course, the first tribute which he's received this morning. He received one before this debate even began from my noble friend Lord Graham in the previous debate. Today he's demonstrated all those qualities again. May I say I'm grateful for his kind words, but I should make it clear that there was no prearranged mutual admiration society between us. Lords, it's sad, as my noble friend said, that he should need to employ those qualities today. His bill's intended to implement the recommendations of our report, published, as he said, 9 months ago. Of course, the government's already published its response on the 20th of May, and hopefully, if my noble friend's bill proceeds to committee, we'll be able to discuss in detail some of the elements of that response. Of course, we are grateful that there was a response, but it is disappointing that it came with no previous discussion on a take-it-or-leave-it basis. I'm aware, of course, that there have subsequently been meetings between ministers and the Macfarlane Trust, and between ministers and a cross-party group of concerned colleagues. But we had hoped that it might at least have been possible to establish a more sustained dialogue, and perhaps my noble friend on the front bench, whom we're so delighted to see with us again, and to whom I must pay tribute for all her readiness to discuss these issues. We hope that she might take back that suggestion. My Lords, a second reading debate isn't an ideal vehicle for discussing details. But here, it's the detail which conceals either the devil or the archangel. Our first proposal was for a statutory committee to bring together clinicians, researchers, scientific assessors, social workers and officials from the Department of Health, together, most importantly, with patients, so that all the expertise and experience could come together and there could be an ongoing dialogue. My Lords, the response is that something of that nature already exists. The Haemophilia Alliance certainly brings together doctors and the Haemophilia Society and others involved in haemophilia care. And the response announces proudly the government will invite the Alliance to meet them twice yearly. Twice yearly, my Lords. We had hoped that there might be a committee which would be provided with a standing secretariat, which would conduct an ongoing dialogue, and which could react to new discoveries and new problems on an ongoing basis, where those concerned would come to know one another as colleagues. My Lords, there are models enough for such an arrangement in many other countries. It brings me no joy to say this, but we didn't form the impression that patients feel represented and that they have the ear of government. They feel that their concerns pass unnoticed and that their voices aren't listened to. Even the Haemophilia Society doesn't appear to us to perceive the Department of Health as a committed partner. Indeed, the evidence, as my noble friend says, the evidence from the Society at the time of the inquiry was that they were so unsure of their financial future that they couldn't guarantee their continued existence. Happily, the government, in its response to our report, commits itself to a subvention of £100,000 per annum for the next 5 years, together with certain other funding from the department. But will there then be a further period when they feel that the government has ceased to listen? Lords, I don't believe that the government is stonily unsympathetic, or that they're stronger on words than intentions. They have many things on their minds. Tragedies come and go, and good intentions are swallowed up by the next claim on their attention. If I may be permitted a quotation, the European Association for Haemophilia and Associated Disorders, abbreviated thankfully to EHAD, in a recent paper had this to say, and I quote, "Clinicians and patient representatives must be part of national and/or regional haemophilia care decision-making in partnership," and I emphasise the word in partnership, with Ministers for Health and Social Affairs and those organisations that deliver haemophilia care. Well, Lords, those words have now have the endorsement of the World Federation of Haemophilia and the European Haemophilia Consortium. Of course, it would be absurd to suggest that nothing's being done. There is a network of provision for those who suffer from haemophilia and from those infected with hepatitis or HIV. But the problem with a network is that some people fall through the holes, particularly where they've grown piece by piece over the years. And they're often brought to the attention of those who can address them, if at all, only by the kind of systematic, ongoing dialogue which we try to suggest. One instance is well known, and it's been referred to by my noble friend. It's never been addressed. The Skipton Fund was established in 2003. It may make payments, inter alia, to the dependents of people who've died from infection with hepatitis C. But the scheme wasn't made retrospective, so that dependents of those who died before the 29th of August 2003 aren't eligible. They have slipped through the net. And then there's provided a window for dependents for those who died before that date and the 5th of July 2004. But dependents of those who died after that latter date are eligible only if the victim had applied to the fund before dying. My Lords, those distinctions are simply artificial. They don't reflect the merits or the need. For those excluded, the cause of death is the same, the tragic loss is the same, and the financial needs are the same, but they aren't eligible for payments. The government, in their response, have noted the problems of the Macfarlane Trust and the Eileen Trust, although there's room for further discussion as to the amount of the provision proposed. But as to the Skipton Fund, they say, and I quote, "The Skipton Fund will continue to make payments to people infected with hepatitis C, and we commit to reviewing it in 2014, when the fund will have been in existence for 10 years. 2014, my Lords. 5 years on from now. And we proposed a new system of payments, creating a direct link between the government and the beneficiaries. And that hasn't been addressed in the response. But 5 years of their lives are important to the victims. Many are in deteriorating health. The government's response doesn't reverberate with a sense of urgency. It may be that in these lean times the department has to fight for candle ends, and I fully recognise that. And in the context of the national budget, of course, these are candle ends. But the government's proposals and our recommendations aren't worlds apart. Yet to those whose hopes depend on them, they appear a chasm. Well, Lords, I hope that if our report remains largely unread on departmental shelves, we've at least laid to rest one misconception. It's surely common ground that infection with hepatitis or HIV, in addition to all the other consequences for the quality of life, can have a devastating effect on the financial resources of a family. That's one issue which my noble friend's bill seeks to address. My Lords, we are discussing people, some of them previously capable of substantial earnings. Some of them, before infection, enjoyed comfortable living standards. Some are now unable to work. Some find their earning capacity greatly reduced. Some have no pension other than the statutory one. And their living expenses are greater than normal because they have increased heating bills, special diets, domestic health. They're living out their lives in constant struggles, not of their own making. Of course, successive governments have now made some provision for them, although it represents not a generous and spontaneous gesture, but compromises of legal claims. And it falls far short of the provision made for victims in other countries, particularly, as my noble friend pointed out, in Ireland. But so often the debate has focused on the question whether the government should provide adequate financial relief because it was the fault of previous governments that the victims were infected. And successive governments have denied, understandably, that they have a responsibility because the disaster wasn't their fault. My Lords, as my noble friend pointed out, on the 25th of March 2004, my noble friend Lord Warner, whose misfortune it was to have been provided with a departmental brief, sought to explain the distinction between the relatively generous financial provision in Ireland and the less fulsome provision in the United Kingdom. In Ireland, he said, and I quote, "A judicial inquiry, the Lindsay report, found that wrongful acts were committed. It's important," he said, "to stress that the blood services in the United Kingdom haven't been found to be similarly at fault." My Lord, I direct no criticism at my noble friend Lord Warner, who had to recite the departmental mantra. But that argument is less than persuasive for two reasons. First, to argue that the distinction lay in the fact that blood services in the United Kingdom hadn't been found by a statutory inquiry to be at fault, overlooks the fact that there hasn't been a statutory inquiry in the United Kingdom because successive governments have refused to provide one. It's like arguing that dinosaurs were harmless creatures because there have been no recent reports of attacks by dinosaurs. But secondly, and more importantly, it addresses the wrong question. What matters isn't whether any government was at fault or whether time limits apply, but what are the needs of those who have to live with the consequences? If my neighbour suffers from misfortunes that haven't been caused by me, I can harden my heart and say they're no business of mine. But a government isn't like a private individual. It can't pass by on the other side. It's the responsibility of government to address the needs of its citizens. And it's not a response to say that a government shouldn't concern itself with them unless it was the fault of the government that they came about. The party which I joined more than 60 years ago was discussing those whose needs formed the subject of the Beveridge Report. The government of that day introduced the National Health Service. They weren't concerned only with those whose misfortunes were caused by the government. In our report, we deliberately declined to address the question of fault liability. I emphasise that we didn't say that governments haven't been at fault. We simply regarded it as irrelevant to our mandate. We attempted to survey the past in the hope that we could learn lessons from the future. But addressing the consequent suffering isn't about the past. For the victims, it is the future. And my noble friend's bill seeks to make that future more tolerable.
My Lords, the House has had the privilege of listening to two not only very well-informed speeches on this subject, but two speeches which I have to say I found immensely moving. Nobody who has had anything to do with this subject cannot but be seriously concerned about the impact which the contaminated blood disaster has had on those who have suffered its consequences. My position was that I was the Secretary of State for Health from 1979 to 1981, at the very earliest stages of what was beginning to emerge as a serious problem. One of my predecessors, the Noble Lord Owen, who also gave evidence to the Lord Archer's inquiry, had already identified from his knowledge as a practicing doctor the need for this country to become self-sufficient in blood products. When I followed the late Noble Lord Ennals, we were faced with the same problem. We were not self-sufficient. And as I explained to the inquiry, I had on my team the late Dr. Gerard Vaughan, himself a distinguished doctor, and I asked him to pay particular attention to this matter, of which he obviously had some knowledge. Sadly, he's no longer with us. But anyone who has had responsibility in this field must feel not only some sense of responsibility, but also some sense of shame that this has dragged on for so long. And I would like to add my tributes to the Noble Lord Morris of Manchester and Noble Lord Archer of Sandwell for the enormous amount of effort which they have made. Lord Morris, for a long time, the Noble Lord Archer, with his, I think, outstanding inquiry, to try and get to the bottom of the problem and identify possible solutions. I think it was, in fact, there's another group of people that also need to be thanked, and those are the private donors who helped to fund the inquiry. and it spelled out, and I don't need to repeat the figures, it was a very modest expense, but it did involve some tens of thousands of pounds, and that was found by voluntary contributions, because successive governments, as has been pointed out, had refused to institute a public inquiry financed from the public purse. But nevertheless, despite the handicaps which the noble Lord Archer faced and his colleagues, who must also be thanked in conducting the inquiry, they did receive a tremendous amount of evidence from a great variety of sources, and with great skill they succeeded in distilling this into what is, by any standards, a very formidable report. My evidence to the inquiry surrounded the fact that I had been invited by one of the haemophiliac sufferers to exercise my right as a former cabinet minister to go back and look through the files which would or might have passed across my desk during my period in office. But as the entire chapter 8 of the report discloses, neither the noble Lord Owen nor I could find any files in existence at all. They had all been destroyed. And as the noble Lord Warner admitted in correspondence to me, his name has been mentioned several times already in the debate, this apparently was inadvertent. I find this quite extraordinary, and it is very difficult to believe how such a major issue could somehow have been expunged from the records by someone at a low level of responsibility and with no senior accountability and certainly no ministerial accountability. It is not in the least surprising in these circumstances that there are those, and I have to say I have harboured the suspicion myself following my discussions, and it's all in the evidence, with the senior officials, including the noble Lord Crisp, who was a year or two ago, 2 or 3 years ago, the permanent secretary to the Department of Health, that somewhere along the line the department had recognised that this was, perhaps as Lord Winston has described it, the most serious, what is his actual words? It's reported as in the report as memorably described by Lord Winston as the worst treatment disaster in the history of the NHS. And I can well understand that the Department of Health have always been very anxious to put this behind them. They have, as the noble Lord Archer has just said, a huge raft of concerns which come, some new and some continuing, and they may not wish to really dwell too much on this one, but it remains a problem for the very reason that the two noble lords have already described. There are still sufferers out there and who have never felt that they have been either properly represented or properly compensated for what they suffered. My lords, I think it's a pity that the noble Lord Morris of Manchester has had to resort to a private member's bill in order to have a full debate on this subject. And I think he deserves tremendous credit for his recess work in trying to turn this report into legislative form, because that is indeed what he has done. And it does give us the opportunity to raise some of the issues that have been already done by the two former noble lords who have spoken surrounding this problem, but above all gives the noble Baroness, the Minister, an opportunity to reply. Having been in the same position, not on this subject, but myself, I must express some sympathy for the position in which she finds herself in this. But nevertheless, I do believe that the Department of Health owes a better explanation and a greater commitment to dealing with this problem. We have not had that so far. The response, as the Noble Lord Archer has said, that was published in May, was in many respects inadequate, and we are still waiting for this. My Lords, I don't know whether anybody else has been approached, but I know that there is an inquiry now being set up in Scotland by the Minister for Health there, chaired by a distinguished judge, Lord Penrose. I know about this because they approached me and said, would I be prepared to give evidence? And of course I said, yes, I would, but I had no more evidence than I had already given to the Archer Committee. They also offered to pay my expenses, but I subsequently had a letter that said, no, that was intended primarily for Scottish ministers and others, not for members of the United Kingdom Parliament. So that anyway, nothing more has been heard. I've not heard anything more about the Penrose inquiry, but that is an official inquiry instituted by the Scottish government, and no doubt it will in due course make progress. It'll be very interesting to see whether, with the resources behind that inquiry, they are able to extract more evidence from official sources than the Noble Lord Archer and his colleagues did in this inquiry. But that we shall have to wait and see. But, my Lords, in the meantime, I believe that the Department of Health, and this is not a party matter at all, the Department of Health owes a considerable obligation to the haemophiliac community and to others who have suffered as a result of this, to give us a much better explanation of their view as to what the present situation is and how they intend to deal with the sufferers. And just one other point. When I met the Noble Lord Crisp, then Sir Nigel Crisp, he explained to me that the HIV sufferers, as a result of a long process of negotiation, had been compensated, and that it was as a result of that being now put behind them that the files had been destroyed. And I said, but surely they must have known that there were hepatitis C patients out there, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease sufferers out there. How could that conceivably have justified the destruction of all the files? And to that, I've never had an answer. The Lord Archer looked at it extremely carefully. He said there was no evidence of any malicious intent in that, because he had no evidence about it at all. But it does make the problem a great deal more difficult, and one can understand lies at the heart of much of the pain and anguish which the Haemophiliac Committee suffers. So I'm sure I'm not alone in looking forward to hearing the response of the Noble Baroness, the Minister. And I end by a note of congratulations to the Noble Lord Morris of Manchester for having given us the opportunity to discuss this issue once again.
My Lords, I should like to add my voice in support of this bill, but I shall try to be brief. For a start, it's Friday morning, but more importantly, others are much better versed in the subject matter and able to deploy the case in detail much better than me. We've heard from 3 of them already, and more are to come. But no one who's read the report of the independent public inquiry headed by the noble and learned Lord Archer of Sandwell, or who listened to the debate on that report in your Lordship's house last April, can fail to have been shocked by the lack of any sense of urgency and the catalogue of denial and prevarication it revealed. Equally, no one who has known and worked with the noble Lord Morris of Manchester for as long as I have done can fail to be impressed by his tenacity and indefatigable persistence in campaigning for justice for those who suffer misfortune through no fault of their own, or who, as in this case, are the victims of state action or the actions of organs of the state, and I pay tribute to him. Over a 45-year career in Parliament, one thinks of thalidomide, vaccine damage, and the fight for statutory recognition of dyslexia and autism. And even after the Noble Lord's distinguished tenure of the office of Minister for the Disabled, the first in the world, when many would have been tempted to rest on their laurels, he has gone on to champion the victims of Gulf War syndrome, to fight for a separate war pensions and armed forces compensation chamber for the tribunal service, and now, over many years, to campaign for justice for those who have suffered, in many cases resulting in death, through the administration of blood and contaminated blood products by the NHS. And as we've seen, Lord Morris is a campaigner to be reckoned with. When the government refuses to set up an inquiry, not once but twice he has simply gone ahead and set up one of his own. And in that connection, I'd like to add my tribute to the work of the noble Lord, noble and learned Lord, Lord Archer, and his inquiry team. But as Lord Morris said in the debate on the 23rd of April, no campaigning should ever have been necessary to right the wrongs suffered by the haemophilia community. The recourse of successive governments to the device of Crown immunity, requiring sufferers to sign waivers in respect of hepatitis C in circumstances where they didn't know that they might have it, but the department knew that they were at risk. The resistance to disclosure of documents to the multi-party group, the refusal to hold an inquiry and then disingenuously rely on the fact that there have been no findings of fault against the British government, the reliance on discretionary trust funds rather than a system of benefits as of right to provide a measure of compensation, the failure to recognise the claims of widows, and the suggestion that unless a government is in some way responsible for a misfortune befalling a group of its citizens, it's under no obligation to relieve it. All these things and more can only bring shame on the reputation of this country in its handling of this tragedy, which has been so much less open and generous than that displayed by numerous other countries. It's not my purpose to troll back through the history of these matters. Nothing can be done about that now, and in any case, the second reading of this bill is not the place. I make reference merely to underline the context in which it seems to me that the only honourable course the government has today, and the only way in which it can go some way to right the wrongs which have been done to the haemophilia community, is to give its support to this bill and bring the recommendations of the Archer inquiry into effect. This is, after all, a fairly modest proposal. In 6 clauses, it provides for testing, treatment, and proper compensation. I should be interested to hear how the Minister could make the case that anything less is due. I support the proposals for direct financial relief for those who have been infected and for their carers, that there should be a statutory committee to advise the government on the management of haemophilia in this country with patient and family representation, that there should be free access to National Health Service benefits, and that there should be government assistance with access to insurance. We now have the government's response to the Archer inquiry, which I fear falls some way short of what Lord Archer and his committee were asking for. But I hope the bill will prompt ministers to look again at their proposals. I will leave others to speak about the detail, the numbers, the money, and the technicalities. It was the ethics and the attitude that particularly struck me. In responding to the inquiry's recommendation of free access to home nursing and support services, the government said the provision of non-residential social care services, such as domiciliary care in England, is a matter for local authorities. Well, my lords, this is indisputable as a matter of fact. But does it match up to what the victims of this tragedy deserve and to the government's responsibility? These people were harmed by the NHS. It's the government's responsibility to put that right. Of course, the government could, if it chose, make the necessary arrangements to meet the recommendation. After decades of obfuscation, the people who awaited this response deserve something better. The government are not unable, and they should act. What chance does this bill have of reaching the statute book? Well, it wouldn't be the first time that the noble Lord, Lord Morris, has made history with a bill in the wash-up. I hope that the government will salvage something of the tattered reputation of successive British governments in this matter and snatch some measure of victory from the jaws of defeat by helping the noble Lord to do so again.
My Lords, I intend to be incredibly brief in supporting my noble friend Lord Morris. I spoke on the 23rd of April. I don't wish to repeat that. Everything still stands. I just wanted to be here today to give him support so that the Department of Health knows there are enough people prepared to get up on a Friday morning to come and support the issue, because it isn't going to go away. I think the bill is a good idea. A bill is always a good idea for a campaigning measure, particularly when it's one that one can possibly get through. So it's a good vehicle. But I have to say, I agree with all that's been said, and I also want to reiterate a point that the noble Lord Jenkin of Roddy makes, and that is to commend the unsung supporters of this measure in terms of the funding of the inquiry. Obviously, I pay great tribute to my noble friend Lord Archer. I was once his PPS 35 years ago. But the fact of the matter is, the funding was important. Modest though it was necessary. The fact that we've got the bill, of course, does prove, I'm very careful about this, that A, the Department of Health doesn't put patients first, and 2, we haven't got the best health service in the world. If we had, we wouldn't have this bill. We'd have dealt with it like others have. I mean, every time I hear this claim, I get irritated about it, simply because one can look at this case of what is, to the centre, what looks like a bunch of little people. And as we've heard from my noble friend, I heard him on the radio this morning, the numbers are getting less. It'll solve itself, this problem. That's the unspoken issue that's actually said in Whitehall at the present time. It's a complete lapse in the good standards of conduct of public administration in this country that we've got to this state. I hope indeed, in terms of, if there is the Scottish inquiry and the details it is, that they've got some more detailed evidence and paperwork that was kept back than we have got in England. I mean, frankly, I've got no evidence, but frankly, a lot of us would not believe what we've been told, but we can't prove the contrary. The fact of the matter is,
I'm grateful to my noble friend. Could I just make it clear? Some 5,000 documents were discovered by the department and given to us too late for us to include in our report. So we may have some optimism about the Scottish inquiry.
Absolutely. I mean, my old friend reminds me of that incident and the complaints made about it at the time. But the fact of the matter is, there may be a possibility, but nevertheless, to argue after all these years, there wasn't the information, and then all of a sudden it becomes available. I mean, in other words, they hadn't taken good, if you like, good administration rules and purposes, knowing there was an inquiry being set up, which had a good degree of parliamentary support, even though it was unofficial. They'd refused to give evidence, but, you know, to search for documents and then bring them up when it was too late on which to take the evidence. Well, you know, it begs the question. I wish my noble friend well on this bill, because he introduces it at a good time in terms of the parliamentary process. It would have a fair wind if people in the other place got up off their knees and looked at particular issues on behalf of individual citizens, Not many thousands of them, but only a few, but that's what it counts. Little things mean a lot. If you get the little things right, chances are people believe you on the bigger things. So there is a good opportunity if it can leave this House and go to the other place before an election is called. One doesn't know, as the noble Lord Lowe just said, that the possibility in the wash-up is enormous. And people want to salvage reputations. That's good. And I mean, the fact is, I say to my noble friend who's going to reply to this debate, I feel she's been very good on this issue, but nevertheless, she's going to have a miserable time. Not today. I'm not on about a miserable time today. But whichever person is on that bench is going to have a miserable time. Whether they be the whip or the minister will have a miserable time, both before and after the election, unless this matter is seen to be dealt with seriously, because the impression is being given that it would go away, we're not bothered. Well, having got a bill in front of us, of course, there's something to get our teeth into and push. And in some ways, whatever the result of the election, it'd be nice to get this bill through beforehand. And I think, as I say, I wouldn't rule that out. But whatever the result of the election, if there's any real sort of backbone and management in terms of the government machine, whoever is the Prime Minister, if they really wanted to deal with this issue, I'll give them a solution. You send back to the Department of Health an ex-minister. You find somebody, and there's enough around on both sides of the House. You send someone back. The civil servant's worst nightmare, a minister who returns, with the avowed instruction from the Prime Minister to get this sorted. Now, that can apply whatever the result of the election. Because there is a serious issue here. And the worry is, of course, it's bound to be for other people. Will other cases, other similar issues, be dealt with in the same way? I mean, the fact is, this is a festering sore now. And now a bill has appeared. It'll keep on festering, and I've used language somewhat more extreme than my noble friend, because he made it quite clear. It's not the NHS at its best, and he's going to go on and on and on. And as long as he does that, I will be with him.
Here. My Lords, I've been moved to take part in the debate on this bill because of the sheer, quiet tenacity of the noble Lord Morris of Manchester. A chance meeting in the corridor some time ago led to a discussion about his great cause of the moment. Lord Morris, as everyone who knows him or has had the pleasure of speaking to him, is a wonderful supporter and a campaigner for those who have no strong voice. Among them are those on the real margins of society with chronic conditions that never seem to come across our paths, who suffer and have suffered in silence for so long. As an aside, it would be wonderful if our powerful media could publicise this cause, and if the Haemophiliacs Society, which is so short of financial support at the moment, could be nominated as the Christmas charity by one of the national newspapers for next year. It's too late this year, but I do think there's something we can do as a group of people who are deeply concerned, and listening to all the moving speeches this morning, that's about the only thing I can suggest from a practical point of view. I'm not going into the Department of Health to look for lost documents. I wouldn't have any locusts there, and they'd kick me out. But there must be something we've got to do. And supporting this bill, of course, is number one, but that's another idea, and I hope somebody would take it up. After researching the whole issue of those who are affected, fatally affected, my lords, by contaminated blood and blood products, after that chance encounter, and after indeed supporting the noble lord in previous exchanges in your lordship's house, I became more and more depressed and appalled. And there is no way I could not support this bill, and I do so wholeheartedly. My sense of depression was somewhat alleviated when I realised that another noble lord, for whom I have the utmost admiration, is still deeply involved in this issue, namely the noble and learned Lord Archer. I have read his report, and I have to admit I've read it reluctantly because it made me feel deeply uncomfortable. I was astonished that such a situation could exist, and I had been oblivious to it. It was rather like the experience I had a couple of months ago when, examining the Coroner's and Justice Bill, I undertook to investigate the issue of the prostitutes exploited and trafficked to provide sex. Of course, the victims of today's debate have no chance of recovering from their dreadful situation. We are talking, my lords, let's not forget, about people who are with a significantly diminished lifespan. My intervention has been motivated by the huge injustice and lack of compassion shown to the victims. As has already been stated, the purpose of this bill is to provide support for people who have been infected with certain diseases as a result of receiving contaminated blood and blood products supplied by the NHS. They were infected by the NHS. Their illnesses are not as a result of a chosen lifestyle. They were infected unknowingly, the tragic victims of mischance, mistake, or negligence. At this stage, I'm going to try and deviate from concentrating on blame, because really it does not help nor strengthen the cause of the victims. Neither will it help the surviving dependents and loved ones. The bill, my lords, is a straightforward case of justice and compassion, a wrong that must be righted, just that. Of course, I know that there are those who will argue that we should apportion blame, and one sympathises with that. But from my book, an in-depth analysis of whom or what was to blame has already been carried out, and I trust that the factors have been isolated to such an extent that the precautionary systems are now in place to make sure, as one ever can make sure of anything, that the root cause will never happen again. And further analysis is not actually the purpose of this bill. I reiterate, it is a matter of justice and compassion. We as a nation can only hold our heads up high if we exercise justice and compassion in everything we do. I just hope that the government will give this bill a fair wind. Now, before looking at the detail of the bill, I must make it clear that as an economist, and I don't often admit that, I'm constantly conscious of the financial impact of any measure we blithely put before the government and demand resources to improve a particular situation. The bill does not give any indication of the likely costs of the measures proposed, but being stark about it, the cost will diminish, and with so few tragic people involved, it is unlikely to be hugely costly in financial terms. Already some 142 million in ex gratia payments has been given to patients and their dependents since 1988, and 46 million is being provided to the NHS to help fund the purchase of clotting factors in 2009-2010. I fear I've already strayed into territory which is both unknown to me and distressing, and I will leave that to others, but suffice it to say that there is a need for an impact statement so we can have some idea of the financial impact of the bill, if, as I hope, it will become an act. The bill as drafted has the great merit of being clear, written in plain English and completely comprehensible to mere lay people like me. Each section of the bill seems logical, comprehensive, and provides answers to the questions that are crowded into my mind when approaching the subject. In addition, it was good to be able to read a technical bill quickly and understand every word. I fear I cannot resist the temptation to articulate the wish that each bill produced in our Parliament was so well drafted. The people who have been treated with and infected by contaminated blood and blood products are central to the bill, and that is exactly how it should be. Turning to the clauses of the bill, I fear my heart sank to see that the objective of Clause 1 is to establish a committee to advise on haemophilia, yet another committee. Please do not let it be another quango. I suggest that a time limit be put on the operation of such a committee. And I have just one further gentle suggestion about this committee. A layperson with a reputation for seeing the world through common sense glasses could bring an additional and different probably helpful perspective. Sometimes the experts get too close to the subject and need a jolt of the ordinary to clear the way. Now to clauses 2, 3 and 4. Of course there should be provision for blood donations. Of course there should be a scheme for National Health Service compensation cards for those affected. And of course there should be provision for compensation for people treated with and infected by NHS contaminated blood and blood products, and their widows, dependents and carers, quoting from the bill. Here, however, I have just one slight moan. What about widowers? I'm sure that is just a drafting point, but I suggest that an amendment be made to a relevant clause, clause 4, to cover this. I particularly approve of the fact that it is proposed that a review will be held within 6 months of the passing of the Act, and that's clause 5. My Lords, this is an excellent bill, and it would result in improving the lot of those so brutally affected. They are a hidden group. They do not seem to have the celebrities promoting their cause. They've been living in despair and without hope, and I nearly wept when I heard the description of the 5 people who wanted to come to give evidence but could not afford to come because they didn't have the fare. What sort of a society are we? It is time that we all realise that we have a duty of care towards these people, all part of justice and compassion. I so hope the bill has an easy passage through both houses and becomes law speedily.
My Lords, when I went to fetch this bill in the printed paper office and asked for the Contaminated Blood Bill, a member of your Lordship's House, who must have come up from the other place, said, "The other place does not have time for such matters." My immediate thought was, shame on them. My Lords, I feel this shows up how very important your Lordship's House is. It does give time for such humane and important matters, and it does give time for scrutiny of legislation. My Lords, I congratulate the noble Lord Morris of Manchester for his continued persistence over this most important and heart-rending matter. I also congratulate the noble Lord Archer of Sandwell for his report, which is of great importance to many people, and the noble Lord will have spent much time and energy over its creation. My Lords, I declare an interest as a Vice President of the Haemophilia Association, and also I personally know of the importance of blood transfusions, as I had my life saved by them when I sustained an internal hemorrhage at the time I broke my back. In later years, I also had blood transfusions when I became anemic after travelling abroad. I also know how important it is to have experts who understand blood complications, as my blood group changed from negative to positive. My Lords, patient safety, particularly when working with blood and blood products and transplantation, should be absolutely paramount. Health safety has not been given the top priority in the past, which it should have been given, and now we have the problems of healthcare-acquired infections and the disasters which your Lordships are discussing today, along with matters which could help these people inflicted, which are stated in this bill, and I do hope the bill will come into law. My Lords, the contaminated blood disaster has been described as one of the most tragic episodes in the health service's history. When haemophiliacs were infected in the early years of HIV with infected factor VIII, my noble friend Baroness Campbell of Surbiton's first husband, who was a haemophiliac, was infected with HIV and died. They lived in North Yorkshire, near where I lived. 75% of the haemophiliacs who were treated at the haemophilia unit in Newcastle-on-Tyne were infected with HIV, as the blood products were imported from the USA. This was because the UK was not self-sufficient in blood products. My Lords, I was introduced by a friend to a young man called Jonathan Miller, who was one of the campaigners for help for haemophiliacs with HIV. Jonathan came to lunch with me at my home in Yorkshire, and afterwards, in my study, in private, he told me what terrible agony he was in with his knee joints. He did not want to discuss this with his parents, and I felt privileged that he wanted to share this secret with me. Sometime later, I attended his memorial service in London. My Lords, again, in the early days, I heard a distraught father tell how his young son, aged 6, and his best friend, both haemophiliacs and infected with HIV, had been denied a visit to Disneyland because they were HIV. My Lords, this was because they had been treated by infected blood products imported from the USA. I felt, and I still do, that the attitude of the USA to these children was unforgivable. My Lords, is it surprising that I support this bill, which gives support for infected and bereaved persons? My Lords, it is not an easy regime to have to deal with being a haemophiliac patient, but they have to. But having been infected by HIV, hepatitis C, and now 802 patients are known to have had blood from donors who subsequently died of vCJD, constituting yet another threat to this community. My Lords, all red blood cells given as transfusions to children under the age of 13 should be filtered to remove the infection that caused the fatal brain disease of vCJD, a government scientific body has recommended. Variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease is caused by mutated proteins known as prions that infect the victim's brain, forming sponge-like holes in the tissue and causing a fatal neurodegenerative disorder. Derek Kenny from Portsmouth died of new variant CJD 6 years ago after being given a contaminated blood transfusion. His widow, Judy, said, "The idea of filtration system is excellent. If it was proven to be effective, then we ought to use it, because that way we can be sure that the blood pool is safe and that everybody is receiving safe blood. Should filtered blood not be offered to everyone, irrespective of their age? Perhaps the Minister can give your Lordships an update on this today." My Lords, I ask the Minister, is it not time that the Government accepts the recommendations of the noble Lord, Lord Archer's report? I hope the Minister today, who I am sure will do her best, will tell us a committee to advise on treatment of haemophilia will be set up without delay. My Lords, there are lots and lots of complications surrounding haemophilia, and these conditions mentioned in Clause 2.2 of the Bill, hepatitis B, hepatitis C, human T, lymphotropic virus, syphilis, and variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. My Lords, expert advice needs to be forthcoming for everybody who needs it, and medical and nursing staff need training. My Lords, this committee should have been set up years ago so that people can share together for the good of patients and their supporters. My Lords, a public inquiry into how people were infected with hepatitis C and HIV from contaminated blood has been set up in Scotland. My Lords, I am a Scot, and when I read what Lord Penrose said, which was, many people have died, many of the people who survive and the families of patients who died deserve our deepest sympathy. Of course they do, but they want and deserve more than sympathy. They want action. This, my Lords, is a running sore which will not heal until there is a satisfactory solution.
My Lords, I thank the House very much for the opportunity to speak very briefly in the gap today, and I want to confine myself to 3 or 4 very quick points, because I have spoken in previous debates about Lord Archer's reports. I want to thank him and the noble Lord Morris for their persistence with this matter. Their indefatigable campaigning is extremely necessary for this group of people. I just want to make a point today which sets out sets the context in which I and my colleagues in the Liberal Democrat Health team are approaching this matter. It is, today of all days, it's easy to make the point. We are told that over the next 4 years there will have to be £20 billion worth of savings in the NHS, £36 billion worth of savings across all government departments. That is the context in which we have to consider this matter. The question, therefore, is how do we, as politicians, answer the undeniable moral case that has been made for these people, for the injustice and suffering that they have had? The answer to that, I suspect, my Lords, is, unfortunately, not everything which is in the noble Lord's bill. And the question that I put to the noble Lord Morris of Manchester, and most strongly to the noble Lady Baroness Thornton, is how do we arrive at a position in which government works with the people who have been affected by this to determine a set of priorities about how to address the issues, the urgent issues of today for some people, and the unfolding issues which we don't even know about yet for the next 20 or 30 years. The noble Lord Archer was absolutely right. It is not acceptable that the government meets but twice a year with the Haemophilia Alliance. And what I want to suggest to noble Lords as a way forward is that there should be a working group under the auspices of some part of government, probably not the Department of Health, which is tasked with coming up with a plan to deal with this issue now and for the next 20 years or so that it will be in existence. I would urge that they look at one thing as a matter of urgency. It's something that's not been mentioned much today. It's meant with the recommendation 8 of Lord Archer's report that there should be a look-back exercise to try and identify those people who may have been infected and who may not yet know that. The government in its response said that it was committed to doing so, and I'd like to ask the noble Baroness if she could answer, tell us in detail how that will happen, when it will happen, and how comprehensive it will be, because that will be a very important means of finding out the true scale of what's happening. My Lords, the people who've been affected by this, by this terrible tragedy, demand and deserve justice, practical help, and ongoing help and change. I think the last thing that we should do is to raise their hopes again in ways which are unrealistic. That would be cruel treatment to people whose trust already has been shattered. The most responsible thing that this House could do is to ensure that there is a realistic response, a practical response to this issue, which is dealt with very, very urgently. And my Lords, I can think of no better way of doing that, and I hope I speak for all Lords noble Lords who take part in this debate, than to send the noble Lord Rooker into the Department of Health to do his best with our full wishes behind him.
So now I also pay tribute to the noble Lord Morris for his tireless work, and to the noble Lord Archer and his colleagues for the report which they produced. I welcome this bill. I'm speaking from the front bench because I consider this to be a matter of justice. It's a wrong which must be righted, as Baroness Cahoyne has pointed out. These are victims who have been damaged by the state, and not entirely inadvertently, because from an early stage concerns were expressed about the possibility of contamination in blood products that were being imported from abroad, and yet health authorities were permitted to use imported blood products in a way which has been a disaster. I think it's shameful that the government has sheltered behind Crown immunity, something which was abolished in 1991. And then, because it shelters behind Crown immunity, to say there are no findings of fault. And as I said in the debate on the 23rd of April, if the government were to take that attitude now, then a test action should be brought to see whether they would dare to rely upon limitation, and they would dare not to waive the Crown immunity, which they could do. I think it's shameful that there has been no public inquiry brought by government, and we await the report of the Penrose inquiry, to which the Noble Lord, Lord Jenkin Roding and Baroness Masham have referred. The fact that documents were destroyed inadvertently is completely unacceptable. And then there was no participation by government in the Archer inquiry, and suddenly 5,000 documents emerged after his inquiry was completed. This is just completely unacceptable. It's been brought home to me in the last few days that it's not just the terrible illnesses that we should be concerned about, but it's the stigma of those illnesses as well. The noble Baroness Lady Masham referred to children who were refused entry to Disneyland. I was told of a widow who, after many years, had summoned up enough courage to start a relationship with another person, found that when he learnt that her husband had died of AIDS as a result of this, he immediately dropped her. Now that is the sort of thing that people have to live with. My lords, not just stigma, but the fact that people are uninsurable as a result of the things that have happened. Lords, that's why I say I welcome the bill and a chance to come back to this subject that we debated on the 23rd of April before the government responded. The noble Lord Archer has pointed out the wide nature of the committee that he proposed and the need for a standing secretariat which he thought was necessary, and that was met by the government saying, well, we have the Haemophilia Alliance which we meet with twice a year. The Haemophilia Alliance no doubt does good work, but it doesn't have representatives of the Department of Health on it. There is no patients or families who are part of it. It meets once every 6 months itself. It has its departmental meeting, presumably now, once every 6 months, and there's no statutory requirement for the Secretary of State to consult the Haemophilia Alliance. So I would suggest to your lordships that the government's response to that part of the noble Lord Archer's report is utterly inadequate. Lords, when it came to the question of National Health Service compensation cards, as proposed by Clause 3 of the bill, that there should be provision for free National Health Service treatment, the government's response in May was to say that, well, we're awaiting the Gilmore review of prescription charges due in the summer. On the 19th of June, a question was asked in another place, and the minister said, well, that review would be published in the autumn. Since then, there has been complete silence. And it's only right that the National Health Service, which was responsible for this disaster, should be under a duty to make free provision for its consequences without any question. As has already been pointed out, the fact that domiciliary care should be shrugged off as the responsibility of local authorities is again a completely inadequate response. Clause 4 deals with compensation, which is the only significant financial obligation in the bill. I say significant, it does obviously involve considerable sums of money. The government says, well, ex gratia payments are enough. That took me back to the criminal injuries compensation scheme, of which I was once, and indeed Lord Archer was once a member. That was a scheme which was put forward on an ex gratia basis, and it was thought to be satisfactory. I resigned when they introduced the tariff system, which cut down people's awards, and then that change was challenged in the courts, and as a result the government were forced to place the criminal injuries compensation scheme on a statutory basis. And the government say, well, victims today, they say it all the time, victims are at the heart of the criminal justice system. So victims of crime for which the government are in no way responsible do get compensation now under a statutory scheme. And that's £200 million per annum currently. There is an assessment body in place, and it is permanent and ongoing. And that's a statutory responsibility that will continue year in, year out, which governments will have to fund. Here we're dealing with a finite number of people who have been damaged not by a criminal, but by the state itself. And how can it be said that that should not be a statutory scheme whereby money is paid directly by the government to those who have suffered? The ex gratia lump sums and discretionary payments made to beneficiaries have been increased in response to the Archer report, and it said that repeat applications to these trusts are no longer necessary. But it is a matter of considerable concern to families that they have to go cap in hand to plead their case consistently to the trust if they have particular special needs. It should be a direct payment under a statutory scheme, as this bill provides. Lords, Clause 4 irons out the artificial distinctions and demands, and it demands that regulations be put in place which don't draw distinctions on the basis of cause, age, date of receipt of contaminated products, the date of death. It provides there should be no means test, no impact on other benefits. The balance between lump sum payments and periodic payments can take into account the financial circumstances of the country at the time. We're in a bad way at the moment, but hopefully that will not be permanent. But as I say, this is a question of justice. Compensation should not be a charge on the National Health Service budget. It's a matter for wider government responsibility, and we should not envisage that compensation paid to the victims of state default in this way should in some way affect the provision of care under the National Health Service to other people. Lords, I too believe that a review within 6 months to consider the present situation and to make recommendations as Clause 4 requires is the right way of going about it. The essential requirement is that this issue should be fully addressed now. There have already died, I think we were given the figures by Lord Morris, 1,974 people as a result of the infections that they have sustained. there should be justice for the living who've been damaged by the state now, while they are still alive. The noble Lord, Lord Rooker, said that the minister will have a miserable time. So be it. But if a particular minister feels sorry for him or herself, I would ask that minister to consider the permanent misery of those who live with what Lord Rooker called, rightly, a festering sore.
My Lords, I don't think I'm chancing my arm in saying that all of us in this chamber approach the subject matter of this bill with a heavy heart, knowing as we do of the extensive suffering and grief which has given rise to it. The story which the noble Lord Morris of Manchester has recounted, and which is laid out in detail in the report of the inquiry, chaired so ably by the noble and learned Lord Archer of Sandwell, is one which can only move us profoundly. I should therefore like to congratulate the noble Lord Morris not only on introducing this bill, but also on his assiduous championing over many years of that group of persons to whom life has dealt the cruelest of hands. My Lords, nearly 5,000 people who received contaminated blood from the NHS in the 1970s and 80s were thereby exposed to hepatitis C, and of these more than 1,200 were also infected with HIV. Almost 2,000 of those people have now died as a direct result, leaving behind in many cases widowed spouses and bereaved children. The origins of the disaster have been well described by noble lords, and I will not repeat them. Successive governments have taken the view that what happened was an accident which time could not have foreseen or been prevented, and that no negligence was involved. Nevertheless, both the last government and the current one recognised the exceptional hardship inflicted upon those haemophiliacs and their families, and that setting aside the issue of causation, what mattered was the well-being of those people in the future. Accordingly, the Macfarlane and Eileen Trusts, followed by the Skipton Fund, were established with the intention of alleviating the financial plight of the victims, a plight which not infrequently was very severe. However, it was the conclusion of the noble and learned Lord Archer that those arrangements, well motivated though they may have been, were inadequate and flawed, and that the time had come for the government not only to make direct payments to the affected individuals and their families, but also to set up permanent mechanisms designed to ensure that the wider need of those people should never be lost sight of. Hence the provisions of the bill now before us, which, as we know, closely reflects Lord Archer's recommendations. My noble friend Lord Howe, who very much regrets that he cannot be present for this debate, has spoken to one particular witness who gave evidence to this inquiry. As a result of those conversations, he is clear that one of the main hardships inflicted by this disaster is the very poor state of long-term health often experienced by the victims, who, as a direct result of having received contaminated blood, have found themselves suffering from incurable and debilitating illnesses. That hardship is frequently made worse by a lack of access to prompt treatment. Little or no recognition is given for the fact that the NHS itself was instrumental in making these people ill in the first place, or for the idea that there is, on that account, an enhanced obligation on the system to look after them as well as it possibly can. It is therefore appropriate and unsurprising that both Lord Archer and Lord Morris should wish to see provision made for access to effective and timely medical treatment for haemophiliacs, a call which I fully support. The anger and frustration which underlies this bill is not hard to discern, as the Archer report spells out, and I quote, "The haemophilia community feels that their plight has never been fully acknowledged and addressed." That complaint surely encapsulates much of the case, and I do not doubt that the noble Lord, Lord Morris, would not have thought it necessary to bring the bill forward at all, had the government responded more tangibly to Lord Archer's recommendations when they were first published. It is, of course, for the government to indicate whether it will now respond positively to the proposals presented here, and for Lord Morris to press them on the government as hard as he feels it's appropriate to do. Nevertheless, having examined the bill in some detail, I can say to the noble lord that there are certain features of it which may not quite do justice to his intentions, and that he may therefore like to consider spending some time in committee to enable some of the detailed wording to be looked at. For example, I am not certain that the function of the new committee in Clause 1 is described as precisely as it ought to be, or that Clause 4 would have the effect of delivering the kind of financial compensation which the noble lord clearly has in mind. There are also some more minor concerns, such as the apparent ambiguity of the territorial coverage of the support arrangements that are being proposed. Nevertheless, these are matters of detail, which it is inappropriate to rehearse at this stage. More important is the need for us to acknowledge the external reality, the distress of the victims of this tragedy, and the uncertainty which they feel about the future came through loud and clear in Lord Archer's report. Many simply want official recognition of what went wrong and why, and an acknowledgement of the suffering that they and their families have gone through, as well as a sense of confidence that nothing like the catastrophe they experienced could happen again. We are debating this bill at a time when worry over NHS blood supplies has shifted from contamination by hepatitis C to a possible contamination by variant CJD, as described by the noble Baroness Lady Massam. We do not know, since it's currently impossible to know, how small or great such contamination may have been, but the explicit provision in Clause 2 for the testing of blood for contamination by variant CJD is a clear and appropriate signal that this is a live issue. When it comes to blood safety, we cannot afford to relax our guard. My Lords, it was a chain of chance circumstances which gave me an involvement in this debate today. I have learnt much, and I am, in all humility, very grateful for the opportunity of so doing. And my Lords, I end as I began, by expressing my admiration for the noble Lord Morris as having brought forward this bill. Not many of us, I suspect, would have remained as undeterred as he by the formidable obstacles in the way of doing so. It is a mark of the noble Lord's deep compassion and sense of humanity that he should have initiated today's important debate. And in thanking him for that, I look forward to hearing the Minister's reply and to the bill's further stage.
My Lords, I congratulate my noble friend Lord Morris on the introduction of this bill and for the excellent and moving way that he introduced it. I'd also like to join with other noble lords in paying tribute to my noble and learned friend Lord Archer for his leadership of and the work of his independent inquiry into contaminated blood and blood products published on the 23rd of February. And indeed thank all noble lords for their contributions, comments and insights. The provisions of this bill are based on the recommendations made in the report of my noble friend's inquiry. And despite the efforts of my noble friend Lord Darzai and I, and indeed the noble Lord Morris, to secure a debate on the government's response to the inquiry, I have to say that we failed with the usual channels, which only just as my noble friend the Chief Whip was sat next to me, I was berating him for just now. We failed to secure time before the summer for that debate, and for that I apologise. However, this bill has given us an opportunity eloquently taken by noble lords in this second reading debate, and I welcome this opportunity too. And I can show my noble friend Lord Rucker and the noble Lord Jenkins, and in particular the noble Lord Thomas of Gresford, that I do not feel in the least sorry for myself. I am always delighted to discuss these important issues, although indeed, of course, I always also welcome good wishes and sympathy. My Lords, the Government is fully committed and indeed fully understands the nature of the appalling tragedy, and we're fully committed to supporting those affected by this tragedy, and we continue to work to provide ever safer blood and blood products. We're also committed to consulting the haemophilia stakeholders in developing a new policy, referred to by the noble Lady Barker, on the treatment of people with haemophilia. This will be an ongoing process covering all aspects of their treatment and care, and will forge links with other groups, for example, specialised commissioners, as required in the health service. My Lords, I fully recognise my noble friend Lord Morris's passionate commitment to this important cause, and I congratulate him on the successes that he has already achieved. Today, I have a number of reservations about whether there is a need for the recourse to legislation. On the 20th of May 2009, the Government published its final response to the noble Lord Archer's report, and we are working to implement the commitments that we made in our response. And I will briefly set out the Government's response. That has already addressed the main elements in this bill before moving on to address specific questions raised during the debate. Addressing Clause 1 of the bill, which provides for a statutory committee to advise on the treatment of haemophilia. The majority of the Department of Health's advisory committees, my Lord, are not established on a statutory basis. And in this case, we are now meeting twice yearly the Haemophilia Alliance, which is an existing UK-wide partnership of patients, haemophilia doctors and others involved with their care. And I'd like to emphasise the issue of patients and their families. Several noble lords have suggested that we are not listening, and I hope that my remarks will refute that contention. At its first meeting, my lords, I am pleased to report it was productive, and it took place on the 20th of November. The group unanimously agreed that it would be helpful for all parties to better understand how specialist services for haemophilia patients are commissioned, and to identify how the haemophilia allowance can influence service provision across the country. My Lords, this committee will meet twice yearly, but it is also setting up a work stream which will be running right through the work of the department with regard to haemophilia. The first meeting also discussed the terms of reference for the group, which includes how new policies will be developed, and indeed how the department will be accountable to the community for making sure that work is carried through. The next meeting date is to be agreed, but it will be in the new year. Similarly, the group agreed to a Department of Health proposal for a workshop. So I'm just making the point that this is not a twice yearly meeting. This is a meeting which is about a work stream. A workshop for patients, carers and health professionals about vCJD. We are planning to hold this workshop during March or April 2010. The outputs of this workshop will be used to help inform future communication with the haemophilia community about the risk of variant CJD. So I hope noble lords will see that this is a result has come about without legislation and with a commitment from the government. Moving on to clause 2 of the bill, this provides for haemophilia patients to be offered testing for a number of specified infectious agents and for blood donations to be screened for those same agents. And I'm pleased to confirm that testing for all but one of the specified agents is already available to haemophilia patients if their clinicians advise they are needed, and that all blood donations are screened for the same conditions. The sole exception, my lord, is variant CJD, for which there is currently no validated test available, but I will update the House later on where we are with that particular issue. And therefore we cannot legislate on something that it is not currently possible to actually implement. Clause 3 provides for a scheme of NHS cards for those infected through treatment with contaminated blood and blood products, which would enable access to NHS benefits free of charge, including prescription charges. Noble Lords will be aware that the Prime Minister's already announced our intention to progressively phase out prescription charges for patients with long-term conditions. Professor Ian Gilmore has completed the review of prescription charges in England that was considering how to implement and phase in the Prime Minister's commitment. We are considering those recommendations, and we will publish that report and a response to recommendations and action in the new year. The other services specified, such as counselling, physiotherapy, are already available in England under the NHS where needed. While statutory guidance to local authorities on charging for non-residential social care services already makes it clear that they have to assess and take into account service users' specific needs and costs associated with their condition or disability. This includes any additional costs related to living with chronic infections. I have to confess I'm puzzled in this clause under 3.3, which says that it should provide priority access to NHS treatments for haemophilia patients wherever possible. And I do wonder if we need some clarification, because I think I need to ask whether this runs counter to the fundamental principles now enshrined in the NHS Constitution, that the NHS provides a comprehensive service based on equality and fairness that is available to all, with access based on clinical need. So I'm sure that the Noble Lord my noble friend does not mean that there should be a rule for one patient group to be treated differently from others.
Grateful to her for the care that she's taken to reply. She may know that I have close contacts with the ex-service community. That in particular, I've been honorary parliamentary advisor to the Royal British Legion for 21 years. In that case, not to refer to any other, in that case, ministers, and I was myself Minister for War Pensions in the 1970s, have constantly, all through the years, made it quite clear to general practitioners that in view of the special position of the ex-service community, people are prepared to lay down their lives in the service of the state. There should be an element of priority. There are certainly precedents for saying that where the state feels a special responsibility for the illness and disabilities of patients, the priority is highly defensible.
Well, I thank my noble friend for that clarification, but I think then perhaps he needs to address that issue in the bill itself. I'd like now to turn to Clause 4, which the Noble and Lord Archer in his report recommended that levels of financial support to those affected by this tragedy should be similar to those paid in Ireland. My Lords, I'd like to take a moment here to just discuss the issue about Ireland, because the situation in Ireland is quite different from the situation here in the UK. And I think there's been some confusion about the background to the establishment of the Irish payment scheme, the reasons for it, and I think so it might be worth taking a moment to explain this background. Between 1977 and 1984, a large number of Irish women were infected with hepatitis C following treatment with a contaminated blood product. As a result, the Irish government set up an expert group to look at the issue, which reported in January 1995. The expert group found that wrongful acts had been committed by the Irish Blood Transfusion Service, which led to the Irish government to set up the Hepatitis C Compensation Tribunal to operate on a non-statutory basis to review claims for compensation arising from the many civil actions pending in the courts. Following the report of this expert group, the Irish government set up the Finlay Tribunal of Inquiry, which reported in 1997. This also found that wrongful acts were committed. Following the findings of the Finlay report, the Irish government placed the Hepatitis C Compensation Tribunal on a statutory footing. My Lord, the Noble Lord Archer's report states that the inquiry did not consider it appropriate to apportion blame, especially given the problems attendant on hindsight, and I think he is right. In recognition, however, of the plight of those affected, the Department of Health has set up the payment schemes that have already been mentioned by the various noble lords.
Appreciate that it is unlikely that Crown immunity applied in Ireland when actions were brought against the state for what they had done, and secondly that they have recognised their responsibility by holding a public inquiry which found fault. This is something that this government has never done.
I will return to Crown immunity and the inquiry in a moment, my lords. So far, over £45 million is paid out for HIV through the Macfarlane.
Forgive me. I hope she doesn't think that I'm being tiresome. I'm grateful to her for giving way. But this is something that perhaps we ought to clarify at the moment. Is it the government's position that the government is under no obligation to relieve suffering which has not been the fault of the government? Because that's the issue.
The government relieves suffering that it has no obligation to relieve in many, many different ways, I would suggest to my noble friend. And indeed is doing so in this case too. If I might just return to the particular clause that we're addressing in this bill. And I do appreciate that people feel very strongly and are angry about this issue. I absolutely appreciate that. We have decided, however, to increase payments to those infected with HIV to a minimum of £12,800 each. The two trusts have the power to make discretionary payments to infected individuals as well as widows and dependents within the annual budget allocation available to them. In addition, the Skipton Fund has so far paid out nearly £100 million to those infected with hepatitis C. My Lords, the Government has committed to review the Skipton Fund in 2014, and I look forward to the findings of the Penrose inquiry in Scotland and that we should take those into account. I have to say, I have a great deal of personal sympathy with the remarks made by my noble friend Lord Archer about this review date, and I think perhaps I need to ask my honourable friend in another place to look at this again. My Lords, I understand the plight of those affected by this tragedy, and that is why we have already paid out almost £150 million to those affected. In Clause 5 of the bill, which requires a review of the number of issues which were covered, all of which were covered in our response to Noble Archer's report, again the question is put whether there is any benefit gained from putting this work on a statutory footing. For example, with respect to insurance, the Association of British Insurers has assured us that insurers do not treat haemophilia patients or those affected only with HIV or hepatitis C differently from people with other pre-existing conditions. In all cases, a person's insurability and the level of premiums are determined through the assessment of their individual risk, and clearly there are likely to be costs in obtaining such insurance, and that is one of the factors that the Government took into account when in deciding to increase the annual payments to those infected with HIV to a minimum of £12,800. If I might return to some of the particular points raised by individual Lords. Lord Morris and Baroness Masham raised issues of CVJD. What have we done to address those issues? The evidence of variant CJD infection was recently found in an autopsy of a haemophilia patient in their 70s who died from unrelated causes. However, the patient had displayed no symptoms of variant CJD nor any other neurological conditions prior to death. Haemophilia patients who received donor-deriving clotting factors have previously been informed by their clinicians of their increased risk of exposure to vCJD via clotting factors, and this finding will undoubtedly have caused concern, mentioned by the noble lady, amongst those who suffer from haemophilia and other bleeding disorders. However, the finding does not increase the risk to those patients or change any means to the way that they are treated. Our priority has been to address the patients' concern and ensure they are able to obtain advice about this new finding and how it may affect them. And this is an important part of our work with the Haemophilia Alliance. Baroness Masham asked about filtering blood and prion filtration. Spongiform Encephalopathy Advisory Committee, which is the government's independent expert scientific committee on vCJD, recommended that filters undergo independent efficacy trials. Blood Services have commissioned an independent assessment for the efficacy of the prion filter currently on the market and is undertaking its own assessment of the quality and clinical safety for filtered red cells. As the results become available, they are considered by the UK Blood Services Prion Removal Working Group. The Independent Committee on Safety of Blood Tissues and Organs, SABTO, which local laws will be familiar with, will advise on whether this technology should be considered for introduction. SABTO has recently advised that it considers there is now sufficient evidence a particular filter is able to reduce infectivity in a unit of red blood cells and has recommended the introduction of filtered blood to under 16, subject to satisfactory completion of clinical trial to assess safety. We are undertaking an evaluation of the cost, benefits and impact on this recommendation, on implementing this recommendation. Noble Lord Morris and Lord Thomas both refer to Crown immunity. And I don't feel it's appropriate, partly because it's not particularly in the bill that is before us today. But what I will say is, with regard to the remarks about BPL, I understand that the activities of BPL were covered by Crown immunity and therefore outside the requirements of the Medicine Act until 1991. This immunity did not protect from civil suit, but only from prosecution under the Medicine Act. Indeed, some affected person did bring action in 1990, which was settled out of court. Affected persons did and do therefore have the right of redress through civil law. However, our legal advice is that an act of retrospection to permit prosecutions under the Medicine Act after all this time would not be accepted by the courts as valid. Lord Morris, my noble friend Lord Morris and Lord Jenkins asked about why the Department of Health didn't give evidence, and indeed several inquiries about the evidence, which I will address altogether from the noble Lord Thomas of Gresford and my noble friend Lord Rooker. Lord Archer asked for someone from the department to meet with him, and officials have done so on several occasions. We have gone further than any other previous administration, I would say, making information for the relevant period available. In total, 5,500 official documents have been released, and Department of Health officials have met with the inquiry team several times to talk them through the documentation. Given that no one currently working in the department has direct knowledge of these events from the 1970s and 80s, there's no additional evidence that any individual could contribute to the inquiry. We regret deeply that some of those documents were inadvertently destroyed. However, I will repeat, 5,500 documents relating to the period have been released and are on the website, and I'm sad that my noble friend Lord Rooker, in berating me and suggesting impropriety in the department, it makes me sad. However, he is right, there is still work to be done, and I think maybe his suggestion, supported by Baroness Barker, may have some merit. The last tranche of these documents were released indeed after the inquiry had completed its consideration. But we released them partly in good faith to show that we were trying here to be transparent. They are available to the public, and indeed, of course, they have been made available to the Penrose inquiry. Lord Lowe asked about financial relief, and we believe there are good reasons for maintaining the established mechanism for paying financial relief. The Eileen and Macfarlane Trusts have developed good relationships with their registrants over the years. This is not a case of going cap in hand. There is a discretionary element in the size of the payments that are made by them, and those decisions, we believe, are best made by the charitable trust with their deep understanding of the people that they're working with, the small group that they're working with, rather than civil servants. Baroness O'Cahoyne raised the issue of, and indeed other noble lords did, about the issue of funding to the Haemophilia Society. We have we are providing £100,000 a year in funding to the Haemophilia Society each year for 5 years to enable them to move to a secure financial funding. In addition to that, there are always the possibilities for them to contract with the department to provide other particular project-based issues. The Noble Baroness also raised the issue of the future safety of blood. The European Directive sets standards of quality and safety for the collecting, testing, processing, storage and distribution of human blood and blood components. The NHS Blood Transfusion and Transplant Authority NHS Blood and Transplant is responsible for ensuring a sufficient safe supply of blood to meet the needs of patients in England and North Wales. This includes a clear responsibility to minimise the risk of blood transfusion transmitting infection to patients. The Independent Advisory Committee on the Safety of Blood, Tissues and Organs advises the UK Health Department on blood safety measures. Baroness Masham raised the issue of our self-sufficiency in blood products, as indeed the Noble Lord Jenkins. The Department of Health reviewed its surviving documentation and evidence from the period when the decision to pursue self-sufficiency was made and found no evidence to suggest that the hepatitis C outbreak in the late 1970s and early 80s in this country could have been avoided if self-sufficiency had been achieved. The issue was one of science, in other words. By early 1980s, there was evidence that commercial, which is the United States provision, and UK plasma concentrates carried a similar risk of transmitting hepatitis. The review was published in 2006 and is available on the Department of Health website. Baroness Barker referred to the Look Back exercise. The Department of Health has agreed to fund a Look Back exercise to ascertain whether patients not already identified with bleeding disorders might have been infected. The work is currently underway with the UK Haemophilia Doctors Association to put this in place, and it will take a while to trace all these patients, but we hope to be able to report on progress in the summer of 2010. I hope that Noble Lords will think that my remarks do not suggest that this government is not listening or not taking action, and we certainly do regard the Haemophilia Society and Haemophilia Alliance as partners in the progress that we need to make on this very, very important issue. And I do think we have put our money where our mouth is. I do also recognise that this is never enough. I think Baroness Barker, as ever, point to both the questions moral, realistic and practical in her remarks. In conclusion, my Lords, many of the provisions in this bill are either already in place or being put in place, and because of that, we believe there is no recourse for legislation on this issue. Also, I think I may have pointed to some technical issues about this bill. I know that the arrangement that's in place may not always be as far-reaching as some of those wish that they would be, and we do need to continually strive to improve services for haemophilia patients and those affected by this strategy. And I think, my Lords, it's only right that I should finish by restating my deepest sympathy on behalf of the government for those affected by this tragedy and restate our continuing efforts on their behalf.
My Lords, I'm deeply grateful to every participant in the debate, by no means least to my noble friend, who's had the very challenging task of responding to the debate. All of the points that have been raised today can, of course, be considered as proceedings on the measure go forward. A working group of the type suggested by the Noble Baroness Lady Barker could well be appointed to work alongside the Statutory Committee, which Section 1 of the bill provides. Indeed, that committee could itself set up such a working group. But meanwhile, my Lords, I much agree with the noble lady that we should look forward and plan, and not simply react to problems. My Lords, on the question of the reappearance of the 5,000 documents shredded inadvertently, I quote the word inadvertently, by an unnamed official at the Department of Health, what happened was that copies of the documents were found in the office of a Scottish legal firm, which Lord Archer received too late for him to take account in the report of his inquiry. Now, Lords, it was the first case in the history of shredding documents that shredded documents have had a second coming. Long may they be kept under lock and key, and more especially at the Department of Health. My Lords, there are other bills awaiting the attention of the House, and in fair to their promoters, I leave it there.
Yeah.
Okay. I beg to move that this bill be committed to a committee of the whole.
Have a second reading.
Pardon?
Beg to move it.
Yes, I beg to move the second reading bill.
Especially this bill be read a second time. May that from say content. Contra not content. A content so.
To move that the bill be committed to a committee of the whole House.
Especially this bill be committed to a committee of the whole House. May that from say content. Contra not content. The content so.